The voice that wouldn't answer the night Dean Martin realized something was wrong. Los Angeles was wrapped in one of those quiet winter drizzles that made the city feel softer than it really was, as if even Hollywood itself were holding its breath. Dean sat alone in his study, the room dim except for the amber glow of a single lamp and the city lights spilling weakly through the tall windows, turning the glass into mirrors that reflected a man who had spent his life making the world laugh, but now felt strangely unable to smile. On the desk lay an unopened envelope from NBC, a half-finished glass of bourbon, and a small stack of yellowed photographs he hadn't meant to take out, but somehow had images of stages long gone, of tuxedos and microphones, of a time when voices like his and Bing Crosby's didn't just fill rooms, they filled eras. Dean had been staring at one particular photograph for nearly 10 minutes, the edges worn soft by decades of handling, the two of them caught mid-laughter during a rehearsal break. Bing's head thrown back, eyes half closed, his hand gripping Dean's shoulder as if the world might tilt without it. Dean's thumb traced the outline of that frozen moment. For reasons he couldn't explain, an unease had begun to coil slowly in his chest. He hadn't heard from Bing in weeks. That alone wasn't unusual. They were both men who understood distance, who could go months without speaking and then pick up mid-sentence as if no time had passed. But this silence felt different. He'd called Bing's number earlier that evening, expecting the familiar warm drawl, the easy humor, the half-teasing greeting that always made Dean feel like a younger man again. Instead, the phone had rung and rung before a polite, unfamiliar voice told him Mr. Crosby was resting, that visitors were limited, that perhaps another time would be better. The words had been gentle, but something in their carefulness had unsettled him. Now, alone with the rain tapping softly against the glass, Dean reached for the phone again, hesitated, then slowly set it back down. As if afraid of what another unanswered ring might confirm, he leaned back in his chair, the leather sighing under his weight, and let his eyes drift closed. Memory, as it always did when he least expected it, carried him backward. He saw them younger. In a crowded studio, thick with cigarette smoke and laughter, Bing standing effortlessly at the center of it, not commanding attention, not demanding it, but drawing it in the way warmth draws people toward a fire. Bing had been already legendary then, a voice the country trusted, a presence that felt permanent, as if America itself might sound different if he ever stopped singing. Dean, still carving out the man he would become, had been nervous that first time they shared a space. He remembered how Bing had noticed it, how he'd leaned over and said, low enough that only Dean could hear, "Relax, kid. They don't need perfection. They need you." It wasn't a grand speech. It wasn't a lesson delivered from above. It was simply one man seeing another and offering him a place to stand. Dean had carried that sentence through decades of applause and criticism alike. The rain outside deepened, its rhythm slow and steady, and Dean opened his eyes again. The photograph was still there. Bing's smile was still frozen. But the man in the room felt older now than he ever had under any spotlight. He stood, moving slowly, crossing to the window. The city glimmered below him, indifferent and bright, as if unaware that somewhere not far away, one of its defining voices was growing quiet. Dean rested a hand against the glass, feeling the faint coolness seep into his palm. He thought of all the words he had never said. The conversations postponed because there was always another show, another recording, another tomorrow. He thought of how many times he and Bing had traded jokes when sincerity had been sitting patiently between them, waiting to be acknowledged. Success had made them symbols. Time had made them careful. And somewhere along the way, honesty had been left behind stage doors with the coats and applause. The phone rang. The sound cut through the room so sharply that, for a split second, Dean didn't move. He simply stared at it, as if afraid it might vanish if he blinked. Then he crossed the room in 2 long strides and lifted the receiver. "Dean Martin," he said, keeping his voice light by instinct. There was a pause. A breath. Then a woman spoke, her tone professional, but threaded with something else. Dean recognized immediately finality. "Mr. Martin, this is St. John's. We're calling about Mr. Crosby." The room seemed to tilt, though nothing moved. Dean tightened his grip on the phone. "Yes," he said, "he's awake. And he's asking for you." The words landed with a weight no applause had ever carried. "How is he?" Dean asked, though part of him already knew. There was another pause. Longer this time. "He's very tired," the woman said carefully. "If you're going to come, it should be soon." Dean didn't remember putting on his coat. He didn't remember picking up his keys. He only remembered the feeling of moving through space while his mind remained fixed on a single image. Bing's hand on his shoulder. That easy laugh, that voice telling him to relax, because the world didn't need perfection, it needed him. The rain had turned heavier, streaking the windshield as he drove, blurring streetlights into long, trembling lines of gold. Los Angeles at night had always felt like a stage set, but tonight it felt like a cathedral, hushed and echoing, every mile a quiet procession. Traffic was mercifully thin. Dean drove faster than he usually would have, not recklessly, but with the focused urgency of a man who knows time has narrowed into something fragile. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his thoughts were anything but. He wondered when the last time had been that he'd truly looked at Bing instead of seeing him. He wondered if Bing knew how many nights his records had kept him company in empty hotel rooms. How many times his voice had steadied Dean's own before a show. How often he had been a reminder that fame didn't have to harden a man. The hospital rose ahead of him. Pale and quiet, its windows lit like watchful eyes. He parked, stepped out into the rain, and for a moment simply stood there, letting the drops soak into his coat, as if the cold might prepare him for what waited inside. Then he went in. Hospitals always had a way of shrinking the world. The halls were too white, too clean, too stripped of distraction. Dean's footsteps echoed softly as he followed the nurse. The smell of antiseptic replacing the familiar mix of smoke and cologne and stage dust that had defined most of his adult life. They passed doors behind which lives continued, paused or ended, each one carrying its own unseen story. At the end of the corridor, the nurse stopped, turned to him, and gave a small nod. "He's in here." Dean's hand hovered over the door handle for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then he pushed it open. The room was dim, lit mostly by the glow of a small lamp near the bed. Machines hummed softly, their steady sounds filling the spaces where conversation might once have lived. Bing Crosby lay propped against white pillows, thinner than Dean remembered, his face pale, his eyes closed. For a moment, Dean wondered if he had arrived too late. Then Bing's chest rose, shallow but certain, and Dean released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He stepped inside quietly, as if sound itself might disturb the fragile balance of the room. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, resting his hands on his knees. For a long time, he simply watched. The man before him was still Bing. He could see it in the familiar curve of his brow, the gentle set of his mouth, but age and illness had softened the edges, turning the legend back into something more human, more intimate. Dean felt a sudden ache behind his eyes, not the sharp sting of tears, but the deep pressure of emotion that had nowhere yet to go. "Binging," he said softly. The eyelids fluttered. Slowly, as if lifting a great weight, Bing opened his eyes. They found Dean's face, and for a moment there was confusion there. Then recognition, and then, unmistakably, relief. "Well, I'll be," Bing murmured, his voice faint, but still unmistakably his. "You always did know how to make an entrance." Dean smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You called," he said. "Figured I'd better listen." Bing's lips curved, just slightly. "Still taking cues from me after all these years," he whispered. Dean leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs, bringing himself closer. "How are you really?" Bing's gaze drifted toward the ceiling, then back. "Tired," he said simply. "Not the kind a good night's sleep fixes." Dean nodded. He knew that kind of tiredness. He had seen it in dressing rooms, in mirrors. In the quiet moments when a man finally admitted that no amount of applause could refill certain spaces, they sat in silence for a while, the machine speaking gently for them. Dean found himself studying the lines on Bing's face, each one a small map of laughter, worry, love, and time. He wanted to say so many things. He wanted to thank him, He wanted to apologize for every call not made, every visit postponed, every moment he had chosen comfort over honesty. But the words felt too big, too heavy to trust to his voice. Instead, he said, "They're all still listening to you, you know? You go on the radio, you go on those records, it's like you never left." Bing's eyes softened. "Funny thing about voices," he murmured. "They stay when the rest of us can't." He shifted slightly, wincing, then settled again. His gaze held Dean's now, steady and intent. "Dean," he said. "Yeah. Come closer." Dean stood, moved to the side of the bed, and leaned in. Bing's hand, thin but warm, lifted from the blanket and found Dean's wrist. The touch startled him, not because it was weak, but because it was still unmistakably Bing's. Still present. Still here. Bing drew him nearer, his mouth close to Dean's ear now. His breath was shallow, each one measured, as if counted. "There's something I never said," Bing whispered. Dean closed his eyes, and Bing began to speak. Dean leaned closer. Close enough now to feel the fragile warmth of Bing's breath against his cheek, close enough that the quiet machinery of the room seemed to fade into something distant and unreal. Like a tide pulling back from shore, Bing's hand tightened faintly around his wrist. Not in fear, but in something steadier, something intentional. As if he were anchoring himself to the present for the few moments he had chosen to claim. His eyes searched Dean's face with an intensity that startled him. It's not because it was desperate, but because it was clear, focused. Stripped of the easy humor that had always been Bing's armor, whatever was coming next was not meant for an audience. It was not meant for memory. It was meant only for the man leaning toward him now. "You remember?" Bing whispered. His voice barely more than air. That night in New York. The winter, the snow trapped everyone inside the plaza. Dean's brow furrowed. The memory stirred slowly, like a photograph surfacing through liquid. "We were supposed to fly out," he said quietly. "Show got canceled. Whole city shut down." Bing's lips curved faintly. "You were furious. You said the storm was stealing your time," Dean exhaled, almost smiling. "Sounds like me." "It does," Bing murmured. "But you don't remember what happened after." Dean was silent. Bing's gaze drifted toward the dark window, as if the rain beyond the hospital glass were now falling over Manhattan streets instead. "We ended up in that empty ballroom," he said. "No audience. No lights. Just a piano somebody forgot to lock. You sat on the edge of the stage. Wouldn't even touch the microphone. Said it felt pointless without people."
Oh.
Dean's throat tightened. He remembered now. The quiet. The vastness of that empty room. The way the chandeliers had hung like frozen stars above a floor no one crossed. "You started playing," Bing continued. "Didn't sing. Just played. Something slow. Something tired. And after a while, you stopped. You put your face in your hands. You didn't think I saw?" Dean's chest felt heavier. "You said," Bing whispered. "I don't know who I am when nobody's watching." Dean's eyes closed. Bing turned back toward him, and the look in his eyes carried a depth that reached far beyond the hospital walls. "That was the first time I ever saw you afraid," he said. "Not of failure, not of critics. Afraid of silence?" Dean swallowed hard. "I was drunk," he said quietly. "No," Bing replied gently. "You were honest." The word settled between them, soft and heavy all at once. "I never answered you that night," Bing went on. "I cracked a joke. Made you laugh? Broke the moment, like I always did. But I went back to my room afterward and I sat on the bed for hours. Because you'd said out loud what I'd spent years trying not to hear in myself." Bing paused, drawing in a careful breath. "I didn't know who I was without the sound either," he whispered. "I didn't know who I was if nobody needed me to sing something into their living room, to their car, into their Christmas morning. And that scared me more than anything." Dean felt something break open quietly inside his chest, not violently, but like ice shifting underwater. All those years, Bing continued, we filled rooms. We filled cities. We filled the world. But we didn't fill ourselves. Not all the way. We kept thinking the next show, the next applause, the next success would finally do it. And it never quite did. The The machines hummed softly. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled. Life went on in ordinary ways, while something extraordinary unfolded in a dim room at the end of a corridor. Dean finally spoke. His voice low and thick. We were good at being needed. Bing's mouth softened. We were, he agreed, and terrible at being known. The words struck deeper than any review, any headline, any praise Dean had ever received. I didn't call you here to talk about being sick, Bing said after a moment. Doctors do that. Nurses do that. I called you because there are things a man can only say to someone who saw him before he learned how to perform himself. Dean leaned closer still. There were nights, Bing whispered, when I listened to your records alone, not as Bing Crosby, just as a man sitting in the dark, and I would hear something in your voice you never let out on stage. Something tired, something tender, something that didn't want to be charming. And I would think, there he is. That's him. That's the one he hides, so the world can keep smiling. Dean's eyes burned. And I wondered, Bing continued, if anyone ever did that for you. If anyone ever listened past the act. Dean shook his head almost imperceptibly. Not many. Bing's grip tightened again. I did, he said. I always did. Silence that followed was not empty. It was full of unsaid gratitude, full of years, full of roads taken and not taken. You know what the cruelest thing about time is? Bing asked softly. Dean didn't answer. It convinces you that you can postpone honesty, Bing said. It whispers, later. It tells you there will always be another quiet moment, another drive, another drink, another show after which you can finally say what matters. And then one day, it doesn't. Dean felt the truth of it like a weight against his ribs. I used to think legacy was what stayed behind us. Bing went on. The music, the films, the pictures, the stories people tell. But lying here, I understand something else now. Paused, gathering breath. Legacy is what we leave unfinished in people, he whispered. The sentences they keep carrying because we never gave them an ending. Dean closed his eyes as a memory surfaced uninvited. The countless times he had told Bing they should get together soon. The easy promises never anchored to dates. The comfort of familiarity that had disguised itself as depth. There's something I need to finish with you, Bing said. Dean opened his eyes. Bing shifted slightly, pain flickering briefly across his face before he mastered it. He leaned closer, bringing his mouth nearer to Dean's ear again. His voice now so quiet it seemed meant for a place deeper than hearing. I spent my life being the voice, Bing whispered. But I was rarely the man, you. You were the man pretending to be the voice. And I never told you how much that mattered to me. Dean's breath caught. You made it human, Bing went on. You made it imperfect. You made it safe. When I heard you, I didn't feel like I had to live up to something. I felt like I could finally step down from it. Tears slid free now, unannounced, tracing slow paths down Dean's face. He didn't wipe them away, and there's something else. Bing said. His voice trembled for the first time. Something he hadn't rehearsed. Something he had waited too long to protect with. Humor. Dean leaned in until their foreheads nearly touched. Yes, he whispered. Bing drew one more careful breath. And then, so quietly that even the machines seemed to lean closer, he began to whisper the words he had carried for decades. Words that would not praise the past, but unravel it. Words that would not celebrate what they had been, but expose what had been missing. And as he spoke, Dean realized with a sudden, painful clarity that whatever Bing was about to say was not meant to comfort him. It was meant to change him. Dean did not realize he was holding his breath until his lungs began to burn. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had leaned in. As if time itself had narrowed to the fragile space between Bing Crosby's lips and his ear. The gentle hum of the machines had softened into something almost ceremonial. A quiet rhythm marking the seconds of a moment that would not repeat. Bing's hand still circled Dean's wrist. The contact no longer steady, but intentional. Like a man anchoring his final words to another living heart, so they would not drift away unfinished. His eyes closed briefly, not in weakness, but in gathering, as if he were reaching inward to retrieve something that had waited far too long to be spoken. When people think of us, Bing whispered, his breath warm and faint, they think of voices. They think of ease. They think of charm and jokes, and how simple we made it all look. His eyes opened again, and there was something inside them Dean had never seen before. Not even on the hardest days of work or the longest nights of exhaustion. It was not sadness. It was clarity. They don't think of the hours after the lights went out. They don't think of the hotel rooms where the laughter stayed on the other side of the door. They don't think of how often we sat with everything we'd built and still felt uninhabited. Dean's throat tightened, his head dipping slightly closer. There was a night, Bing continued. Long after the world decided who I was supposed to be, when I stood in front of a mirror and realized I didn't know how to speak without performing, I didn't know how to be quiet without disappearing. And I remember thinking, with a kind of cold wonder, so this is what it costs to become something everyone recognizes. Bing's grip trembled, then steadied again. You were the only man I knew who walked that same line and still let the cracks show, he said. You hid them, yes. You made them charming. But you didn't erase them. And because of that, you became the place I went when I couldn't bear the sound of my own name anymore. Dean felt the truth of it settle like weight and warmth at once. There were nights I called you, Bing whispered, and hung up before it rang. Just because hearing your voice on the answering machine felt like proof that someone still existed outside the stage. Dean closed his eyes. And here's the thing I never told you, Bing said. His voice lowered even further. Dropping into a register meant not for ears, but for memory. I didn't envy your success. I didn't envy your ease. I envied your permission. You gave yourself permission to be unfinished in public. You let people see the man leaning on the song. I spent my life making the song stand where the man should have been. A faint breath escaped Dean's chest, unsteady. Bing shifted again, a flicker of pain passing through him like weather. When it cleared, something else remained behind. Resolve. I need you to understand this, he whispered. What I'm about to say is not about regret. It's about inheritance. Dean's brow furrowed. We think inheritance is what we leave, Bing went on. But it's also what we give someone to carry forward. And I have carried something for too long alone. The air felt charged now, as if the quiet itself were listening. There was a season, Bing said slowly. When I almost stopped, Dean's eyes opened, not singing, being clarified. Living. The words hung there, stark and unadorned. I didn't tell anyone, Bing continued. Not the papers. Not the studios. Not even the people who shared my table. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself it was the cost of the work. I told myself I simply needed rest. But the truth was, I was empty in a way sleep doesn't touch. Dean leaned in closer, his voice barely sound. Bing. It was you, Bing interrupted softly, who pulled me back without knowing you were doing it. Dean shook his head faintly. You invited me to that little place in Palm Springs, Bing said. No cameras. No industry. Just heat and a beat-up piano and too much quiet. We didn't sing for 2 days. We didn't perform once. We cooked. We walked. We sat on the patio at night and listened to the wind instead of ourselves. Dean remembered. A hazy, gentle memory. Laughter without timing. Silence without pressure. I had decided, Bing whispered, that if I still felt nothing after that weekend, I was done. I didn't know what done meant yet. I only knew I couldn't keep waking up to a life that felt borrowed from a man everyone liked more than the one inside my skin. Dean's heart pounded, and on the third night, Bing continued, you fell asleep in that chair with a book on your chest, and I watched you breathe. I watched you sleep without an audience, without music, without being anyone's comfort, just a man existing. Bing's voice fractured slightly, and something in me remembered how to exist too. The room felt unbearably still. So when I tell you, Bing whispered, that you saved me, I don't mean in some poetic way. I mean you stood where I could see a life not built for applause, and it gave me one more. Tears slipped freely now down Dean's face, silent, unstoppable. There is a weight that comes with being someone's shelter, Bing said. Even when they never told you you were. And I never told you. Not because I was ungrateful, but because I was afraid if I said it, I would finally have to admit how close I had been to letting go. Dean pressed his forehead gently to Bing's temple. I wish I had given you more, he whispered. Bing's mouth curved faintly. You gave me yourself. That was the rarest thing in the room. They stayed like that for a long moment, the years dissolving between them. The world reduced to breath and memory and the quiet courage of saying what had once felt unsayable. Then Bing's hand tightened. Again, there's one last thing. He whispered. Dean lifted his head. This is the part that will hurt, Bing said softly. Not because it is cruel, but because it is unfinished. Dean nodded. Bing drew in a slow, careful breath. I am not afraid to stop, he whispered. I am afraid to leave you believing that what made us matter was the sound. Dean stilled. It wasn't, Bing said. It was the space between the sounds. It was who we were when no one was listening. And I need you. After I'm gone, to protect that. To live there more than you ever did when I was alive, to recognize it. Right? Dean's lips parted. But no words came. Promise me, Bing whispered. Dean pressed his hand over Bing's. I promise. Right. Bing's eyes closed again, and when he spoke this time, his voice was barely more than a movement of air. Then listen carefully, he whispered, because the next words are not for tonight. Dean leaned closer still, his ear nearly touching Bing's lips, and Bing Crosby whispered the sentence he had never allowed himself to form until this moment. A sentence that did not look backward at who Dean had been, but forward at who he would have to become. A sentence that would not echo in theaters, but would follow Dean Martin for the rest of his life. Dean did not move. He remained exactly where he was, bent toward Bing Crosby's mouth, as if the air itself might still be carrying the shape of the words that had just been whispered there. The sentence had not been loud. It had not been dramatic. It had not been crafted for memory. But it had entered him with the weight of something irreversible. Bing's breath was faint now, his eyes closed, his hand still loosely resting within Dean's grasp, but the room felt different, altered in some quiet, permanent way. Outside the window, the rain had softened into a thin, patient drizzle, tapping gently against the glass-like fingers that did not want to interrupt. The machines continued their low hum, faithful and indifferent, but Dean was no longer hearing them as sound. He was hearing them as time. He did not yet know whether Bing had fallen asleep or slipped into something deeper. He only knew that something sacred had just ended and something demanding had begun. The final whisper had not been a confession. It had not been a goodbye. It had been a charge. Don't let them turn you into a memory, Bing had whispered. Stay where life is unscripted. Stay where no one is listening. That's where you'll find me. The words pressed against Dean's chest now, not painfully, but insistently. As if they were asking to be lived rather than understood, he stayed there, holding Bing's hand. Long after the room had quieted into that distinct stillness that does not belong to sleep. He spoke once, softly, saying Bing's name, not to wake him, but to acknowledge him. There was no answer. He said it again, a little louder, and felt the air take the sound and give nothing back. When the nurse finally came in, her steps measured, her face already gentle with knowledge, Dean did not turn. He did not need the words. The silence had already given them. She checked the monitors. She waited. She placed a careful hand on Dean's shoulder. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Dean nodded once. Though he was not sure to what he was agreeing, loss, gratitude, the ending of something vast. He remained seated while she did what she needed to do. He did not watch. He did not look away. He simply stayed. When she left them alone again, the room felt larger, emptier, as if the presence that had once filled it had not departed but dissolved. Seeping into the walls, the light, the very air Dean was breathing. He had stood on countless stages. He had known the roar of rooms full of strangers calling his name. He had known the precise loneliness of hotel hallways at 2 in the morning. But nothing he had ever experienced felt like this. The quiet after a voice that had shaped generations stopped shaping sound. Dean eventually rose. Slowly, his joints stiff, his body feeling as though it had aged years in an hour. He adjusted the blanket gently over Bing's chest, not as a gesture of duty, but as one of familiarity, the same way he might have once straightened a collar before a show. He rested 2 fingers briefly against Bing's wrist, though he no longer needed proof. Then, almost without thinking, he leaned down and spoke once more. "Thank you," he whispered. The words felt insufficient, but they were true. The days that followed blurred together in a way time often does after something irreversible. There were calls. There were arrangements. There were quiet voices and careful sentences. There were reporters who spoke of legacy and history and the end of an era. There were tributes already forming, montages of laughter and music and effortless charm. Dean participated when required. He nodded. He answered. He smiled when politeness demanded it. But something in him had stepped elsewhere, because the world was remembering. Bing Crosby, and Dean Martin was carrying him. He felt it first in absence. He woke one morning and reached for the phone before realizing there was no longer a number he could dial that would place him back inside a familiar voice. He sat at his piano and closed the lid without playing. He stood in his closet and passed over jackets he had worn when Bing was still alive to comment on them. Each small moment carried a quiet shock, not sharp, but disorienting. Like discovering that gravity has changed, the funeral came and went, dignified, crowded, full of the language of tribute. Dean stood among others who had shared stages in history, and he listened as Bing was described in terms the world understood. Icon, pioneer, legend, voice. Each word was accurate. None of them were complete. No one spoke of the man who sat in silence on patios. No one spoke of the mirror he had once confessed to. No one spoke of the nights he almost didn't continue. And Dean realized then that part of what Bing had placed into his hands was not just memory, but protection. The protection of the unseen. Weeks passed. The invitations returned. Appearances, special programs, memorial recordings, offers framed as honor. Dean declined more than he accepted. Not in anger, not in retreat, but in obedience to something quieter. He found himself driving without destination, stopping at places that had no history, sitting in rooms that did not recognize him. He ate alone in small restaurants where no one asked for stories. He walked beaches where the wind did not care who he had been. And slowly, something unfamiliar began to surface. Space. Not the empty kind. The living kind. One evening, months later, Dean found himself back at the piano. Not under lights. Not in a studio. In his own home, the windows open, the sound of distant traffic blending with the soft creak of the bench beneath him. He rested his hands on the keys and did nothing. He did not search for a song. He did not think of melody. He simply breathed. And in that breathing, he heard it not Bing's voice, but the place. Bing had pointed him toward. The unscripted place. The place where a man was not required to become sound. Dean closed his eyes and pressed a single key. The note filled the room briefly and then faded, leaving behind exactly what Bing had spoken of, the space between. He did not play again. He did not need to, because for the first time in his life, Dean Martin was not listening for applause or harmony, or memory. He was listening for himself, and in that quiet, he understood something that made his chest acrimose gently. Bing Crosby had not left him with a goodbye. He had left him with a way to live.